Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So, you can't all be right. That's my point of this video. The fact is, if we look at history and martial arts and weapons and warfare, there is never only one way of doing any one thing, or only one correct answer. And unfortunately, in the modern world, a lot of us have been brought up to think that science leads to one natural conclusion very often. So therefore, in a perhaps more complex thing that's maybe to do with what type of sword do I use if I'm going to fight in urban warfare in 1900, then there is a natural, definite, one only answer. And it's not as simple as that. It doesn't work like an equation or a formula that you plug some numbers in and out comes an answer. The fact is there are too many variables, and this has always been the case. And the variables could be what type of fighting styles are being used, could be what kind of clothes are being worn, whether there's armour involved, whether there's firearms involved, different types of missile weapons, what type of urban setting it is, what the doors and windows are like, what the weather's like, whether it's night or day. There's so many, thousands of variables, probably millions of variables, that in any of these questions of where people ask me what would be the best, a common one is what would be the best polearm to carry in a medieval setting. Well, you know what? If we take that one for an example, polearms, there were lots of different types of polearms. Why do you think that might be? Because they all have different strengths and weaknesses. They all have different advantages and disadvantages. And also remember, in relation to that question specifically, that different polearms might work really well together as having different things. So if we look at a war wagon type thing, a Hussite war wagon, we'll see that they had different weapons in that war wagon. There was a flail, there was an arquebus, there was a bow, there was a halberd, and they worked well together as a unit. So it wasn't that one guy had the best weapon, it wasn't the guy with the gun had the best weapon or the guy with the flail had the best weapon, it's that they worked well as a unit. So it's all about context, yet again. So, you know, and other examples might be, what is the perfect length of rapier? Well, if you look at the rapier treatises, and in fact if you look on the UK HEMA page, when I'm uploading this video a few days ago, this question was asked about what different historical masters say about the perfect length of sword to have in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the answer is that they fit into different groups. It's not, I was about to say that they all have different answers. In actual fact, some of them have the same answers, but other people have completely different answers. So if you look at Marcelli's length of rapier, for example, it's completely different to Thibault's length of rapier, or Swetnam's length of rapier. They all use different lengths of rapiers. Why? Well, personal preference, style of use, whether you were predominantly using it with a dagger or by itself, or maybe with a buckler, whether you were using it in civilian dueling, or whether you were using it in self-defense, so you had to be able to get it out quickly, or whether you were using it in warfare, maybe on a horse, maybe on foot. So many variables, so there's never one perfect answer. And we see the same thing if we look at a basic thing like, what is the best way to use my sword and buckler? Well, actually, we can see if we look at the treatises, there are some common factors between sword and buckler treatises. There's certain universal truths about how to use those weapons. However, there's variation. If you look at I-33 or 133, whichever you prefer to call it, the way of using the sword and buckler in that system is really very different to the way that Marozzo, for example, uses the sword and buckler a few hundred years later, a couple of hundred years later. So, completely different system, but very similar weapons, really. The sword is basically the same. Marozzo may have had a finger ring, and may have had his finger over the guard most of the time, but it's a weapon of basically the same kind of size and shape and weight. And the buckler, well, there's not much to tell the difference between the bucklers he's using. Yes, he has the targa, and he has other types of bucklers in use, but the basic small buckler that he uses is basically the same as was used right the way through the Middle Ages, going back to the 13th century. So there are different ways of doing things. We see the same thing with sword and shield. So when I talked about Anglo-Saxon and Frankish and Viking era shield size, for example, lots of people went, your shield is too small, because Roland Vorcheka said a shield has to be this big. And I, in response to that, showed that actually the archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon graves shows actually a smaller shield was used here, about 50 or 60 centimetres, not the big 80 or 90 centimetre shields that we see from the Viking ships. So clearly the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons didn't agree on the right size of boss-held shield. They had a different slant on it. And equally, if we look at Frankish shields from Carolingian and Ottonian art, they're very often domed. They're not using flat shields like apparently the Vikings or Scandinavians were using. They're now moving to domed shields. So clearly they didn't think that the Viking shield was the best. They thought that the smaller domed shield was the best. Again, difference of philosophy. Even if we go back to the Roman period with shields, the shield that was used by the Roman legionary, the scutum, changed shape, changed size, changed curvature, changed boss design over time, and it wasn't a continual development from bad to better to really, really good. It was that the shield changed with the changing times, with the changing styles of warfare and the environmental needs, all sorts of, perhaps even the materials that were available, and the types of skills that people needed to make certain types of shields and certain types of boss, and a general movement from brass bosses to iron bosses, because of course iron became cheaper. So there's all sorts of factors involved with changing military equipment and why you might choose one thing over another thing in a given scenario. And never underestimate the force and power of human preference. The fact of the matter is that I have certain preference for sabres because I really like sabres. But fundamentally, a sabre, if I just grab one, here we go, here's a sabre, is really no different to lots of other types of sword. It's not very different to a backsword, it's not very different to a scivona, it's not very different to a Highland broadsword to an extent. I mean, we're talking about relatively minor differences. Yes, it's only got one edge, it's slightly curved, this one has a spear point, and this one has a 3-bar hilt. You know, certain types of basket-hilted broadsword, for example, might have more protective hilts, or they might have a double-edged blade, but this doesn't hugely change how you use them. The fact of the matter is, and I made a video about this previously, weapons split down into relatively few groups. You've essentially got about 2 or 3 types of pole arms, you've probably got about 5 types of swords, and you've probably only got about 3 types of knife and dagger. Fundamentally, weapons actually don't vary a lot. And if you go to war with this at your side, or if you go to war with a rapier at your side, or if you go to war with a Highland broadsword at your side, or if you go to war with a katana at your side, the end result is not going to be very different. No one's really going to notice a huge difference. And if we read personal accounts from the 19th century, which is obviously very well documented because there were more literate people and more records being kept, we see that people, for example British officers serving in India, sometimes chose to carry a tulwar. They sometimes chose to have a certain type of sabre rather than another type of sabre. Some officers chose purely thrusting swords that were essentially rapiers. This was personal preference. It didn't change the course of war, and probably it didn't really change the course of their life either. It was just a personal preference. I slightly prefer this over that. Okay, so personal preference is a very powerful thing in the choosing and development of weapons, but it doesn't really change history. And final example I would give, and I haven't really spoken about this in another video because I don't know a huge amount about it, but Japanese swordsmanship. A lot of people spout a lot of crap about Japanese swordsmanship, and one of the common things I hear is, well, Japanese swords, you never block with the edge. Well, I'll tell you what, from what I've heard from people who've studied Kenjutsu and Iaido, there are different schools of thought that come down to individual thinking, just the same as the European treatises, where there are differences between Manciolino and Marozzo, despite the fact that they both had the same master and came from the same fencing tradition and taught in the same city at the same time. There are still differences between them. Exactly the same as that in Japanese swordsmanship schools or any other martial arts schools. there are individual differences between the schools that very often are down to the fact that one of the masters in that lineage said, oh, I don't like doing that technique very much, I prefer doing this. So from now on in this school we're going to do this technique and we're not going to do that one anymore. Whereas the other school, the other side of the street, still kept doing that technique. This is how traditions form and how different martial schools essentially are founded and diverge into different distinct martial arts schools. So there's never only one way to do things. And if you look at Japanese kenjutsu videos, for example, on YouTube, for yourself, old ones and recent ones, you can see there's a huge variation and difference in the type of stuff that's done in Japanese martial arts, just as there is in European and martial arts from anywhere else in the world. Cheers guys!
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.